The question is that this bill be now read a second time. The member for Hughes.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker. I welcome the opportunity to rise to actually speak on these appropriation bills for 2008-2009. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Rudd Labor government's first budget has been found to be lacking in several areas, and over the past few weeks particularly, and I wish to look at a few of those areas of concern that are of interest to myself and to my constituents. They, of course, include petrol prices, grocery prices that were also of concern to the Prime Minister prior to the last election, but particularly to carers and to pensioners, and also the Northern Territory intervention. Firstly, I would like to put on record for my constituents that I do not support Fuel Watch. The planned Fuel Watch price monitoring system will fail all families and crush many a small business. You need not to look any further than the Minister for Resources and Energy and his letter to his colleagues in which I quote, "The biggest losers would again be working families in places like Western Sydney." Well, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, I represent a part of southwestern Sydney, and I'm very pleased that I have the opportunity to stand up for them because this government won't. This is a government that only took 6 months to lose touch with ordinary Australian families. The honeymoon is over and the division within is becoming public. The Prime Minister has even given up, as we heard from his Adelaide declaration, and I quote, "We've done as much as we physically can to provide additional help to the family budget." Well, Prime Minister, there is a chance that Fuel Watch will even increase the cost of petrol, and the advice from the department, his own department, has now been made public last week, which said that econometric modelling undertaken by the Australian Competition and Consumer Price Commission is somewhat inconclusive with respect to the overall pump price, but indicates that a small overall price increase cannot be ruled out. The proposed scheme will also result in an increase in the compliance burden in the economy, with Treasurer estimates indicating that the proposed scheme will result in ongoing increased operating costs of around $4,000 per annum to affected small businesses. This is a real concern to the many small businesses that make up the electorate of Hughes. But the Prime Minister's department is not the only one against this proposed system. As well, the Minister and the department, as well as his own Minister and the department, there were others that were again against the scheme. These included the Department of Finance, which said, "Finance considers that the introduction of a price commitment rule may result in higher average petrol prices over time." And again, the Department of Resources and Energy said, "The scheme will reduce competition and market flexibility. It will increase compliance costs and has more potential to increase prices." Another department, another important key department, the Department of Industry, said it is concerned about the anti-competitive effects of the proposed Fuel Watch scheme. Further bodies and organisations also listed their concerns regarding petrol prices, which is of main concern to ordinary working Australian families. The RACV said in March this year that it believed the introduction of a 24-hour rule for petrol pricing as used by the West Australian Government's Fuel Watch scheme would be detrimental for motorists and would create higher fuel prices. The RACQ said in April that the government needed independent expert evidence that a West Australia-style Fuel Watch scheme would really deliver low prices. Later it said the federal government's desire to get fuel prices off the newspaper's front page at any cost could be at the expense of most motorists. And the RAA of South Australia said most of the experts pushing for Fuel Watch scheme seem to be poorly informed. And looking at some of the recent media reports, it doesn't get much better for the government. Some of the headlines included, "Rudd begs for time as petrol makes us fume," "Fuel Watch to hurt Western Sydney," another said leaky vessel will sail on with Fuel Watch. Another said fuel leaks could explode Rudd's petrol policy. And another said cabinet leaks leaves Rudd petrol strategy in tatters. Under the pump was another headline, and another petrol leak rocks Rudd. But seriously looking at the future, economists are telling us that the cost of oil is going to continue to rise. Therefore, more effort needs to be put into finding alternatives. Oil is a precious resource and it is used in the manufacture of polymers and chemicals, yet we burn it for energy. Alternatives at the moment include LPG and hybrid cars. There are also some promising technologies on the horizon with the much-hyped Chevy Volt plug-in vehicle. General Motors is set to get the Volt into production by 2010. Looking long-term with hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, there is a lot more work to be done, especially in regard to infrastructure. And as a matter of fact, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, I can't help thinking that a lot of the great fuel companies themselves have actually helped to actually engender this scarcity. In the past, where initiatives have been brought to them for biodiesel fuels or other alternatives, many large fuel companies have been known to actually buy up those copyrights and virtually just sit on them. Another of Kevin 07's favourites was grocery prices, but the Prime Minister seems to have gone missing on this issue now he is in government. We are hearing reports that food prices could double within a few years at the back of global shortages and soaring fuel prices. The drought, a shortage of water and agricultural land, unstable demand from China and India, and a lack of investment in research have combined with higher oil prices to create a grim future for Australians and indeed members of third world countries. Australia has had its worst rice crop in more than 80 years, and rice, wheat and corn prices have more than doubled in the past 2 years. But one of the biggest disappointments in this budget, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, was the treatment of carers and pensioners. The Prime Minister before the budget was making comments such as, "There is no way on earth I would leave pensioners in the lurch." Also, when on his visit to Honiara, he said that they are at the forefront of our attention and they will be the case when we frame this budget, and that will be seen on budget night as well. Well, unfortunately, the Prime Minister did not deliver. This budget does not include anything at all for carers, especially when it comes to people who require supported accommodation for their adult children with a disability, except perhaps to promise yet another review. Mr Deputy Speaker, I would like to actually raise the matter in my budget reply speech regarding the Northern Territory intervention. For several years I have actually been privileged to be a member of the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Torres Strait Island Affairs and got to visit and meet many of the people of our remote Indigenous Australia. There was a matter that I actually raised in my budget in reply speech on the 7th of June 2000, which was 8 years ago. And it seems that there are some issues that are a little bit like weeds in the garden. You can actually spray them with weedicide or even dig them out, but they keep coming back. And this is the issue, actually, of the abuse of women and children in remote Indigenous communities, because it was the subject of my speech back in the year 2000, and also the impact of the harm that's caused by pornography. 8 years ago, I actually said that there was a war zone in Australia, and it was more dangerous than any battlefield. It existed in many of our Indigenous remote communities, particularly in the rural regions of Queensland and Northern Territory and West Australia and South Australia. But of course, it was not exclusive just to those communities. I was actually referring to the findings of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islands Women's Task Force on Violence, which was actually commissioned by the Queensland Parliament, and it was reported back to the Queensland Parliament in the previous December, that's 1999. This report was actually led by Professor Bonnie Robinson of Griffith University, and she was supported by several Indigenous women elders who are and were then congratulated in their courage for speaking out about the scourge that was the plight in their communities against, I might say, against threats and intimidation by many of the male elders. But one of the reasons that I sat up and took notice of the report at that time was that it contained the views of ordinary Indigenous Australians, ordinary women and children, and even aged Indigenous Australians in those remote communities.